In April of 1895, a libel trial took place in London that would forever change history. It was a case brought against the famously irate and aggressive Marquess of Queensberry by none other than the legendary poet Oscar Wilde, two extremely well-known and equally cartoonish forces. You see, it's probably not news to you for me to say that Oscar Wilde was a gay man. Everyone knows this, but it was this very trial that made him the premier homosexual. The first case that truly established the public image of what a gay man looks like, acts like, and sounds like. Oscar Wilde was the very picture of what a stereotypical gay man became: effete, artistic, witty, eccentric, and lavishly dressed. But also a threat to the heart of masculinity and safe heterosexual social bounds. Because Wilde was in a dedicated and intimate relationship with none other than the Marquess of Queensberry's son, Lord Alfred Douglas, known popularly as Bosie. This relationship sent Queensberry into a rage, unleashing a string of aggressive attacks on Wilde, culminating in a note left for him that read, "To Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." And instead of doing the smart thing and tearing the note up and moving on with his life, Wilde did the unthinkable. He took the Marquess to court, and within a few years, Oscar Wilde would be dead. In some ways, what happened to Oscar Wilde was a self-fulfilling prophecy of his own creation. After all, as a schoolboy, he had once quipped that he would like nothing more than to be the hero of a great cause, and to be forever known as a defendant in a case Regina v. Wilde. It's a comedy of errors with a tragic end, hysterical at points, and breathtakingly sad at others. All at once, the result of bad legal counsel, Wilde's own hubris, and the inciting pressure of Bosie himself. This is why you shouldn't take legal advice from twinks. But really, how did things go so wrong? And how did this trial officially create the modern homosexual? Come learn with me. What do we make of Oscar Wilde after he was a legend? I think David Schultz puts it best in Redressing Oscar: Performance and the Trials of Oscar Wilde. Wilde was both a victim and a culprit in his own demise. In addition, while Wilde's homosexual activities were the chief focus of the trials, they were not the only aspects of his personality that made him anathema to the Victorian middle classes. In fact, during the course of the trials, Wilde symbolized a much broader spectrum of perceived decadence and degeneration that to late Victorians threatened cultural collapse as the century drew to a close. In short, Wilde functioned as a cultural lightning rod for an anxious fin de siècle England. His homosexuality was significant yet incidental, symptomatic rather than casual in relation to his crime. Before all that, though, Oscar Wilde was still incredibly interesting. He was born at 21 Westland Row in Dublin, Ireland, to Jane and William Wilde. Young Oscar was homeschooled early on and learned both German and French. And in school, he quickly displayed what would become his most notable traits: his wit and his grand imagination. His impeccable academics, too, earned him a notable scholarship to Trinity College Dublin, and then half scholarship to Oxford. It was there that he became involved in the aesthetic movement and the decadent movement, both favorites of any self-respecting homosexual. He set himself apart visually, too, with his long princely hair and bright patterned clothes, and his affinity for maximalist, garish, and very kitsch decor. He held grand parties and became involved in the theater. By the 1880s, Wilde moved officially to London, where he enjoyed his burgeoning reputation as an aesthete and began his writing and lecturing career. It was here that he met Constance Lloyd, and in 1884, Wilde proposed, and the two were quickly married. As they made expensive renovations to their home to keep up with Wilde's image, the couple gave birth to two sons, Cyril and Vivian. After Vivian's birth, they could no longer afford more children, what with all the spending, and so the couple ceased their sexual relations. I feel really bad for Constance. She was really also a victim in all this. She was very innocent and very dedicated to Oscar through everything that happened. So it's just really tragic in every single pathway. And this was, of course, part of the reason why Wilde threw himself so intensely into the homosexual underground of London. And this was also the time that Wilde met Robert Ross, who was a particularly openly gay 17-year-old. Ross, an ardent fan who had recently been beaten for reading Wilde's poems, was intent on seducing the older poet, and he succeeded. Wilde's entry into gay life was secured, and his writing now consistently was informed by his experience as a gay man. And in 1892, Wilde's friend, Lionel Johnson, or maybe more than friend, I don't know, there's competing accounts, no one can agree, brought a new face to Wilde's home on Tite Street. Johnson's cousin, Lord Alfred Bruce Douglas, the son of the Marquess of Queensberry. Douglas, who was known as Bosie, would be the greatest fixation of Wilde's life. Bosie hailed from an extremely notable Scottish family, extending back in their title to, ironically, the reign of two different King Jameses of Scotland, one being the notorious gay king that I talked about in a previous video. King James I of Scotland awarded the second Earl of Douglas's son the barony of Drumlanrig, and later on, King James VI and I, the gay one, appointed the Duke of Queensberry. So, hilariously, despite the Marquess of Queensberry's vitriol towards gay people, he owes his family's title to one. Bosie was the third son born to his parents on October 22nd, 1870, and due to his charming good looks and feminine aura, he was consistently a favorite among other boys at school. The thing is, for a country so preoccupied with beating down homosexuality in the Victorian era and beyond, England sure did have an awful lot of rampant homosexuality in schools. Of course, a lot of this is due to the fact of the schools being homosocial, boys surrounded by other boys, raging hormones, etc. But the fact of the matter is, it was an open secret, and Bosie easily sank into his popularity at Oxford as Twinkatron 5000. As his schooling drew on and his circle of lovers, friends, and confidants grew, it's no wonder he was eventually introduced to Wilde. After all, this was the year that The Picture of Dorian Gray was published, and with it, Wilde's reputation as a writer had grown considerably. Both men had differing accounts of how this first encounter went. Bosie later wrote that it was the ordinary exchange of courtesies. Wilde was very agreeable and talked a great deal. I was very much impressed, and before I left, Wilde asked me to lunch or dinner at his club, and I accepted his invitation. A few days later, Wilde gave Bosie a signed copy of Dorian Gray, and Bosie claims that Wilde came on to him and he rejected him. But their relationship was destined to grow regardless of who was telling the truth, because Wilde claimed that it was love at first sight, and shortly thereafter, Bosie's brother Percy came to Wilde for help, begging him to assist Bosie with a blackmailer threatening to expose his relationship with another boy near Oxford, which of course he did. Wilde, despite his many flaws, was rarely one to turn down a friend in need. Of course, it helps if they're devilishly handsome. Within 6 months, the two were officially a pair. Bosie also insisted that although he was crazy about Wilde, he was never genuinely attracted to him because Wilde was apparently seriously uggo, but being with Wilde offered him an entry into an even more vibrant circle of gay life, and Bosie's poetry was greatly influenced by it. His most famous poem, written in 1892, is titled Two Loves. "What is thy name?" he said. "My name is Love." Then straight the first did turn himself to me, and cried, "He lieth, for his name is Shame. But I am Love, and I was wont to be alone in this fair garden till he came. Unasked by night, I am true Love, I fill the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame." Then sighing, said the other, "Have thy will, I am the Love that dare not speak its name." Although Bosie and Wilde remained firm partners, it seems their sexual relationship was fairly brief in the grand scheme of things. When things fizzled down to simply romance with Bosie, Wilde sought sexual fulfillment elsewhere, with Bosie's help, of course, and that usually ended up being in the arms of various rent boys, or male prostitutes and other young men. The most important new connection being Alfred Taylor, whose entire business was being the guy who introduced rich gay gentlemen to young working men who would sleep with them for some cash. It's important to note that Wilde fell into this not just for sexual pleasure, but also from a sort of anthropological interest. He had an intellectual excitement from trying to actually get to know these young men and figure out what their motives were, how their lives had gone, picking their brains philosophically. He also genuinely enjoyed just kind of hanging out with them, and the fact that he was taking them to dinner in plain view of polite society was all the more exciting. It was a thrill. Sadly, this game of his would be his ultimate downfall. In 1893, Bosie made the poor decision to leave Oxford and abandon his degree. His grades were shit, and he never did his homework, and rumors abounded that he had been penalized for the blackmail debacle. This, of course, pissed off his mom and dad, his dad, the Marquess of Queensberry, especially. And this guy was actually not hard to piss off. In fact, pretty much everything pissed him off, but at least this one was a little bit justified. Queensberry was commonly known as abusive and prone to rage, and Bosie's ongoing relationship with Wilde was beginning to set him off. Even worse, Wilde and Bosie were starting to have some pretty extreme and frequent fights, leading Wilde to write to Bosie's mother, asking her to get Bosie to find a goddamn job, or at least get his life together some other way. And she was like, yeah, fair point, and subsequently shipped Bosie off to Cairo, Egypt to stay with some friends. This was fortuitous timing because Bosie had just gotten himself into a rather horrible predicament. He had been introduced to a 16-year-old boy by Robert Ross, who was still close friends with both Bosie and Wilde, and had subsequently slept with him. The boy's father went to the police, but dropped the charges to keep his own son out of prison, and so Bosie went and bided his time in Egypt. Understandably, Queensberry became more paranoid. He also became significantly more abusive, writing numerous letters to Bosie, disowning him and claiming that he wants him to burn in hell. On June 30th, 1894, Queensberry appeared in Oscar Wilde's home and tormented him with a shouting match of all sorts of extreme expletives. Wilde said, "Lord Queensberry, do you seriously accuse your son and me of improper conduct?" To which he replied, "I don't say you are it, but you look it, and you pose it, which is just as bad." In retaliation, Bosie sent a telegram to his father reading, "What a funny little man you are," which he must have known sent Queensberry spiraling into an uncontrollable rage. The Marquess replied, "If I catch you again with that man, I will make a public scandal in a way you little dream of. It is already a suppressed one. I prefer an open one, and at any rate, I shall not be blamed for letting such a state of things go on." Well, he did let such a state of things go on for almost another year, in fact. All of the while, he set about having detectives follow Wilde and Bosie around, and even stalked them himself. Wilde and Bosie blatantly insisted on hanging around each other in public after all, and Bosie even threatened Queensberry in a rather ominous letter that read, "If OW was to prosecute you in the Central Criminal Court for libel, you would get 7 years penal servitude for your outrageous libels. Much as I detest you, I am anxious to avoid this for the sake of the family, but if you try to assault me, I shall defend myself with a loaded revolver, which I always carry, and if I shoot you or he shoots you, we shall be completely justified, and I think if you were dead, not many people would miss you." A significant issue was that Queensberry had cut Bosie off financially, so he was relying on his mother and Wilde for money, and because Wilde was intensely obsessed with Bosie, who was admittedly manipulative, he was spending lavish amounts of money caring for him and entertaining him. Money that Wilde should not have been spending, especially given the ever-quiet presence of his poor wife and 2 children. And what finally worsened Queensberry's temper beyond repair, had actually not to do with Bosie, but with the eldest Douglas brother, Francis Douglas, the Viscount Drumlanrig. For a long time, Queensberry had suspected his eldest son of being in a homosexual relationship with Lord Rosebery, Drumlin Rigg's boss, who was indeed a gay man. Queensberry had already attempted to assault Rosebery with a whip, and then Drumlin Rigg became engaged to a young woman, and while hunting with his soon-to-be brother-in-law Gerald Ellis, Drumlin Rigg was discovered behind a bush, dead from a shot through the mouth. The public generally agreed that it must have been suicide, although most historians argue back and forth and will never really know for sure what happened. Regardless, the incident fully destroyed Queensberry's last grip on sanity, whatever little there was. As Bosie biographer Douglas Murray writes, Queensberry wanted to make his son pay for his disobedience and revenge his late heir's death on the homosexual that he could most easily get at, Oscar Wilde. In his frustration at being ignored by his family, Queensberry decided to take his case to the public arena, and began his attempt to goad his son or Wilde into taking out a charge of libel against him. This man, he wrote to Percy Douglas of Wilde, is a cocksucker. He kicked off his actions against Wilde by buying a ticket to the premiere of The Importance of Being Earnest, one of Wilde's most successful plays. He arrived at the theater holding a frankly hysterical bouquet of phallic-looking vegetables, but because he had been yapping all around town about his plans, his ticket was cancelled beforehand, and they didn't let him in. Then he moved on to his fateful Plan B. He appeared at Albemarle, Wilde's club, and handed a card to the porter for Wilde, who got it 10 days later. It read, "For Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." I think it's definitely an understatement to say that Wilde was fucking beside himself after receiving this card. Almost everyone in his life was telling him to just tear the damn thing up and move on. After all, the only other person who had seen it was that hotel porter, and that guy probably sees a lot of crazy shit, so he probably doesn't care. Not to mention, everyone and their uncle knew about the Marquess of Queensberry's violent and paranoid nature, so it's hard to really take him seriously. Nevertheless, Oscar was overcome with panic, and Bosie was ready to take advantage of that, insisting that Oscar take Queensberry to court for libel. Wilde, Bosie, and Robert Ross went as a group to the office of Travis Humphreys, a solicitor, who then filed a warrant to have Queensberry arrested on March 2nd. Then Humphreys got a hold of lawyer Edward Clark, who agreed to represent Wilde on the grounds that there is absolutely no truth to what Queensberry alleges. Wilde lied and said it was absolutely untrue. And then, in a move of insanity, Wilde and Bosie went and fucked off to the south of France for a vacation instead of preparing for the trial. Whether they were in denial or just extremely confident in the case, who's to say? But a crowd of Wilde's friends and loved ones spent the days leading up to the trial begging Wilde to drop it or just spend some time overseas. But the ever-frustrating Bosie interjected, "You're telling him to run away shows you are no friend of Oscar's. It is not friendly of you." And that was that. Wilde's editor Frank Harris desperately told him, "You don't realize what's going to happen to you. It's not going to be a matter of clever talk about your books. They are going to bring up a string of witnesses, and that will put art and literature out of the question." But it was too late. S.I. Salamensky writes in Representing Oscar Wilde, Wilde's Trials, Gross Indecency, and Documentary Spectacle, friends' accounts depict Wilde as confused as to what the point of his suit was: to defend himself, his wife, and his sons from what could be ruinous rumors, to revenge himself on the irksome Marquess, thus securing his son's fickle affections, to stage another sold-out show, rendering the courtroom a theater. It is indeed unclear from Wilde's tactics whether he wishes to challenge the court's approval or flout its rule, challenge Queensberry's characterization of him, or prove its acceptability. On April 3rd, 1895, the trial began at Old Bailey. The lawyer representing Queensberry happened to be a man named Edward Carson, who was an old rival of Wilde's from Trinity College. Edward Clark began his attack by smartly trying to defang any effect that Wilde's writing, especially his letters to Bosie, may have on his character, insisting to the court that they must remember that Oscar Wilde is no commercial writer. He's a poet and an aesthete, and so his floral language is not a representation of any immoral acts. So that was a good start, but then unfortunately Wilde took to the stand to be questioned by Carson. He started off in an extremely bewildering way, by lying pretty much right off the bat, saying that he is 39 years old, which Carson caught instantly, asking, "I think that you are over 40, is that so?" "I don't think so. I think I am either 39 or 40. 40 my next birthday. If you have my certificate, there, that settles the matter. You were born, I believe, upon the 16th of October, 1854. "Yes, I have no intention of posing for a younger man at all. I tried to be correct in the date. That makes you over 40. Very well. So, great start." Carson then set in on grilling Wilde about the morality of both his own poems and stories, in particular, The Picture of Dorian Gray and the poems of Bosie. He picked at every little detail that could be construed as queer or morally debatable, and the thing is, most of Wilde's works were either openly queer or queer-coded, so this really wasn't a hard task, but in his ever-drawling wit, Wilde managed to dance around every question and insinuation with jokes and philosophical quandaries, bringing the cross-examination out of the literal realm and into something more vague and difficult to put into black and white categories. It's a strategy he had planned ahead of time, viewing this as his greatest strength and also an opportunity to use the courtroom as a sort of theater of its own, a grand stage where Wilde, so confident that he could win, could play with these forces, trying to incriminate him as if they were characters in one of his books. But they weren't just characters, and this was not a stage, and Wilde had no idea that Carson was slowly leading him into a trap. A well-written book putting forth sodomitical views might be a good book. No work of art ever puts forward views of any kind. What? No work of art ever puts forward views. Views belong to people who are not artists. There are no views in a work of art. We will say a sodomitical novel might be a good book according to you. I don't know what you mean by a sodomitical novel, don't you? No. I will suggest to you Dorian Gray. Is that open to the interpretation of being a sodomitical book? Only to brutes. Only to the illiterate. Perhaps I should say brutes and the illiterate. Have you ever adored a young man, sometimes 21 years younger than yourself, madly? No, not madly, not madly. Well, adored him? I have loved one friend in my life. I prefer loved. That is higher. Adored, sir? And I say loved. That is greater. Never mind going higher. Keep down to the level of your own words. Keep your own words to yourself. Leave me to mine. Don't put words to me that I haven't said. Semantics, semantics. You can only get so far with that. The second day of the trial was where everything really came to a head. As the evening news reported the next morning, the Wilde case is sinking deeper and deeper into a foul morass where it becomes increasingly difficult to follow it. The fine verbal fencing of the first day has done little to relieve the horrible darkness of the succeeding passages of the trial, and even the Old Bailey recoiled with loathing from the long ordeal of terrible suggestion that occupied the whole of yesterday when the cross-examination left the artistic literary plane and entered the dim-lit, perfumed rooms where the poet of the beautiful joined the valets and grooms in the bond of the silver cigarette case. And when Oscar Wilde left the box, the little light that had relieved the awful somberness of the picture died out, as Mr. Carson went on to paint a horrid nocturne of terrible suggestions, a thing of blackness, only half defined, but wholly horrible. The proceedings that morning started off similar as before, with Carson poking and prodding Wilde about various young men he had known or associated with, and with every smug and witty answer that Wilde gave, he made every attempt to spin it into something implying his guilt, always trying to catch Wilde off guard. This led to even more extremely goofy exchanges. Now, after lunch at Café Julian, did you suggest to Fred Atkins to have his hair curled? No, I told him I thought it would be very unbecoming to him. He suggested it himself. At this, the audience broke into laughter. Then there was a conversation about having his hair curled? Yes. What did he say? He said he thought he would like his hair curled. I said I didn't think it would be at all becoming. You brought him out to dinner that evening? Certainly. And I believe you gave him an excellent dinner? I never do anything else. I give excellent dinners. And plenty of wine? That is the point exactly. You must make out whatever gentleman dines with me, or guest, or whatever you call him. I suppose he is not stinted with the wine. If you ask me whether I ply people with wine, I say such a suggestion is monstrous and I won't have it at all." More audience laughter. But although Wilde seemed to be holding his own well and with good temper, Carson had more than enough men to reference and even question him about, and even Oscar Wilde began to falter. The real turning point came when the grim onslaught of questioning finally caught Wilde off guard in his witticisms. Carson asked regarding a young man named Walter Granger, "Did you ever kiss him?" To which Wilde replied, "Oh dear no, never in my life. He was a peculiarly plain boy. I thought him his appearance was so unfortunately, very ugly. I mean, I pitied him for it." You can imagine the air in the room must have gone cold at that moment, and Carson had found his attack opening. "Very ugly. Do you mean that in support of your statement that you never kissed him?" "No, I don't. It is like asking me if I kissed a doorpost. It is childish. Didn't you give me as the reason that you never kissed him that he was too ugly?" "No." "Why did you mention his ugliness?" "No, I said the question seemed to me like you're asking me whether I ever had him to dinner and then whether I had kissed him. Seemed to me merely an intentional insult on your part, which I have been going through the whole of this morning." "Because he was ugly?" "Why did you mention his ugliness? I have to ask these questions. I say it is ridiculous to imagine any such thing could possibly have occurred under any circumstances." "Why did you mention his ugliness?" "For that reason. If you asked me if I had ever kissed a doorpost, I would say, no, ridiculous. I shouldn't like to kiss a doorpost. Am I to be cross-examined on why I shouldn't like to kiss a doorpost? The questions are grotesque." "Why did you mention the boy's ugliness?" "I mentioned it perhaps because you stung me by an insolent question. You make me irritable." "Did you say the boy was ugly because I stung you by an insolent question?" And Wilde finally cracked, plainly losing his cool. "Pardon me, you sting me and insult me and try to unnerve me in every way. At times one says things flippantly when one should speak more seriously. I admit that, I admit it. I cannot help it. That is what you are doing to me." "You said it flippantly? You mentioned his ugliness flippantly. That is what you wish to convey now?" "Oh, don't say what I wish to convey. I have given you my answer." At this point, there was no longer anything that Wilde could do to save himself. The damage was done. His own wit, his joking about Granger being too ugly to kiss, revealing that there would be a situation where Wilde may indeed kiss another man who wasn't ugly, had damned his case. Reading the uncensored trial transcript published by Merlin, Holland, it's very stark how Wilde shifts his tone right after this. Only halfway through the trial, he is suddenly witless, answers short and toneless. The pride and confidence there before is gone, as the defense presents wave after wave of hard evidence that Queensberry was, indeed, telling the truth. Oscar Wilde was posing as a sodomite. It no longer mattered if he really was one. Given the severity of the situation, Wilde's lawyer begged him to allow him to withdraw prosecution and consent to the charge of posing. And so, the trial ended and Queensberry was declared not guilty. But that was not the end of it. The Queensberry legal team had sent the statements from the witnesses to the Director of Public Prosecutions, and Scotland Yard produced an arrest warrant for Wilde. Magistrate John Bridge made an attempt to allow Wilde to escape England by refraining from signing the warrant until after the last train for Dover had departed. Unfortunately, Wilde had apparently fallen into what some called a pathetic state of indecision while discussing what to do with Bosie and Robert Ross. When he learned of the warrant, he simply sat down in a chair and drank until the police came for him. About 2 weeks later, Wilde found himself in court once again, this time as the defendant. He had a grim sense of sobriety compared to before, as witness after witness after witness testified to him soliciting them for sexual acts. In one final act of defiance, Wilde made a lone speech defending queerness. The love that dare not speak its name in this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is that deep spiritual affection that is pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of those like Shakespeare and Michelangelo, and those 2 letters of mine, such as they are. It is in this century misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man, when the elder has the intellect, and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks at it, and sometimes puts one on the pillory for it. Sudden applause broke out in the audience, but it was no use. It was still a hung jury, and he was forced to appear for yet a third trial. By this point, even Queensberry's lawyer Carson was asking for Wilde to be let off the hook, many people urging the court that Wilde had suffered and been punished and humiliated enough. What really is the use of convicting him now? Isn't it too cruel? In most other cases, it would not have fallen on deaf ears. But some speculate that in the end, Wilde was convicted regardless because Lord Rosebery, who happened to be the Prime Minister by this time, was being blackmailed by Queensberry that his gay relationship with the late Lord Drumlanrig would be exposed if he didn't destroy Oscar Wilde. That, plus the fact that the judge in this case was kind of a mad freak who had prosecuted rapists and murderers, but for some reason called this case the most disturbing case of his career, and he simply could not have a man that disgusting walking free. Like, okay. The Wilde trials are fascinating for a million reasons, but namely because within a short span of time, without most people even realizing it, the trial became less a libel suit and more a tool for Victorian England to try and purge itself of a greater social threat by making an example of a particularly famous pansy. David Schultz continues, a great deal of the trial's cultural significance was molded by a sacrificial paradigm. Chief among the projects in any sacrifice is the creation of a proper victim, a scapegoat who embodies those characteristics the community wishes to expel and whose sacrifice will effectively rid the culture of its crisis by destroying the socially repellent attitudes along with their embodiment. Well, Wilde was summarily shipped off to prison, where he suffered for 2 years under hard labor. While doing his time, he wrote an extremely exposed letter to Bosie called De Profundis. After being released from prison, a now significantly less healthy Wilde refused to adjust his behavior. Everyone already knew he was gay, so what's the point now in pretending otherwise? Robert Ross, who had stayed by his side, did the same. Wilde spent his remaining years in Italy and France, living a mostly quiet and reflective existence, broke and depressed, but not fully disheartened. He passed away in a Parisian hotel in 1900. As for Bosie, he never emotionally recovered from what happened in court. The writer Rupert Croft Cook described him as being like a hurt boy. The eyes were brilliantly expressive, often merry, but sometimes pained and resentful. The features, which in boyhood were so delicately modeled, had grown pronounced, the nose formidable, the corners of the mouth turning down petulantly. His raging temper that he inherited from his father never abated, probably not helped by his firm desire to reinvent himself after Oscar Wilde. In 1902, 2 years after Wilde's death, he married Olive Custance and had 1 son. He got involved in politics, all in the midst of an unusual revival in Wilde's popularity. The decadent and controversial play Salome had recently been adapted to an opera, helping to breathe new life into a new, more liberal and sexually creative movement in the arts. Wilde was transitioning from his role as a polarizing, scorned, foppish poet to the new martyred figurehead of a dawning era. As Ross made sure to help usher in this new immortality for Wilde, Bosie drifted more and more conservative, angry, and religious, openly despising his gay past, causing him and Ross to get caught in several years-long rivalries that eventually became deeply hostile. Bosie took Ross to court for libel, only for the secret De Profundis letter to be shown during the trial, proving Bosie's relationship with Wilde. It's a nauseating and very sad, almost point-for-point mirror of the very trial that ended Wilde himself. Bosie obviously lost. He involved himself in yet more miserable court cases before dying in 1945, having finally made some peace with his history with Wilde. He wrote, "Many years after Wilde's death, and after I had become Catholic, I reacted violently against him. Converts are very apt to be censorious and to be more Catholic than Catholics. I hope I am now more charitable and broad-minded than I was. After swinging to two extremes in my estimate of Wilde, I have now got into what I believe to be a happy mean." The years following the Wilde trials, though, were terrifying ones for the gay community of Britain. For one thing, it set a frightening precedent. The courts now had standing to prosecute gay people with severe intensity, and police harassment of the same energy followed. It would take until 1967 for homosexuality to finally be decriminalized in England. But all through that time, things were changing drastically. Where gay men before the trials could easily sit in the shadows and often be ignored, even at their most effeminate and obvious, afterwards the boundaries of what constituted safe and acceptable behavior, dress, relationships, hobbies, art, and literature, all became more and more constrained, and anything that could be thought of as remotely queer, that is, anything that seemed to be Wildean, was now suspect and threatening. Oscar Wilde had now become the blueprint for what a homosexual is, and therefore, anyone who exists in the nebulous cloud around his traits is unacceptable and obviously gay. This is a twofold issue. For one thing, it narrowed the scope of what counts as correct masculinity. What makes someone a man is now inherently tied to sexuality because gay men are now stereotyped as being effete and foppish, with eccentric fashion and artistic tastes. Gay men were also now pathologized, especially by the emerging realm of sexology, as being a different gender altogether. Now for the subsequent result of this happening. Effeminate gay men who identify with Wilde obviously began to imitate him more and more, as Wilde became an icon and sort of saint for the queer artsy underground, creating a self-fulfilling cycle. And then gay men who don't identify with Wildean traits and present more straight-passing, don't easily fall into these stereotypes, so where do they fit in? Well, they get their own classifications too. More and more, the world of gay men evolves in sight of its newfound visibility and villainization, and the people who find community in being scorned do what many marginalized communities often do. They start to adopt the names thrown at them by normal people, the hateful and terrified outsiders, as traits that they're proud of. We're here, we're queer, and Oscar Wilde gave us a direction. So rarely before, if ever, had this invisible, disparate group of people ever had a figurehead who was so unashamed of being gay after he had been crucified for it. In trying to destroy Oscar Wilde to neutralize the gay threat, the court at Old Bailey caused the threat to instead bloom under pressure. So this may seem completely off topic, but bear with me. Almost exactly a year ago, I was trying to fly home from my research trip to Europe, going from Paris to Dublin to Chicago. Landing in Dublin, we hit an intense storm, and the plane had to abort landing multiple times before safely touching down. Even though I was the first person off the plane to try and make my connection, I literally sprinted what felt like a mile through the extremely poorly designed Dublin airport. I still missed my flight and was also not given a new ticket. I was stranded in Dublin for days before I managed to get on a new flight home. But while I was there, on an unintended addition to my trip, I realized that I could make the most of it and check out the birthplace of Oscar Wilde. And to my surprise, once I got there, across the street, a very funny statue of Oscar Wilde lays in repose on a boulder. Like, genuinely, it's in character, but also, like, damn, we get it, he was gay. Well, I'm stuck in Dublin for today. My flight home was supposed to be yesterday, and then weather happened, and long story short, I couldn't get another flight until tomorrow. So here I am with my pal Oscar Wilde and his house over there. Trying to figure out what to do. It's Sunday, so not a lot's open. Maybe I'll just hang out with Oscar for a little while longer. I don't know. Even funnier, they have a QR code that you can scan that brings up the voice of Oscar Wilde practically lisping about his childhood in that home.
Behold me here, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. An absurd assortment of names, I know. Splayed in effigy upon a rock not a rotten tomato's throw from the place of my birth. I might be a Prometheus in motley. All I lack is the eagle, which, when the gods tired of tormenting me, gave up gnawing my liver and flapped contemptuously away. But no, I am not Prometheus, nor was meant to be. For what I brought to the undeserving masses was not light, but laughter. Was that my artistic mistake, to make them guffaw when I should have had them weeping for the woes of the world? Fun, unfortunately, was so much fun. If you turn your back to me, as did so many, at the close of my bright day, and ignore that fecundated female on her plinth, you will see over there on the corner the fine house in which in 1854 I was born. I wonder if I should have stayed in Dublin. A flailing whale in a pond of minnows. Mustn't brag, however. The mighty dead are required to be modest. It makes us less intimidating. Or so they say. Oscar Wilde? Modest?
As I sat there listening to this audio and cackling to myself, I had to admit that it probably is incredibly accurate, and the truth is, maybe Wilde would have even approved of this statue. Ever the individualist, he probably would have loved this representation of himself in stark difference to basically every other statue of famed names in Dublin. He would have probably loved his infamy, the over-the-top caricaturization of his name and image. Last year as well, I saw a small local production of a queer take on the importance of being earnest, Wilde's final play, and one heavily inspired by his quarrels with Bosie. I really felt like he may have loved that too if he were still around. Anything to keep his art alive, to evolve on it. And after I finished writing my script for this video, I remembered something else. Chicago has a restaurant themed after Oscar Wilde. Obviously, I had to go check that out too. Oscar Wilde's name and art are forever omnipresent in the culture. By martyring him, the British court made him immortal. They created an infinite number of subsequent Oscar Wildes. By trying to make an example of the most famous, most identifiable homosexual, they bred 1 million of him forever after. Homophobia, as it is today, is ultimately the creation of the Oscar Wilde trial, and simultaneously threatened by it by bringing the queer community out of the shadows. True that in going into the libel trial, Wilde wanted to free himself of the ever-looming threat of his boyfriend's weird dad, but it was something much deeper too. As his grandson Merlin Holland writes, "If I could ask my grandfather a single question, it would have to be, why on earth did you do it? But there is no simple explanation for his conduct. Arrogance born of social and literary success, and the belief that he was in some way immune from the law, unquestionably played a part, as did a desire to please young Douglas. I am certain, too, that there was a perverse element of wanting to play out in court a theatrical piece whose prologue he felt he had written, but whose outcome was known only to the fates. The danger, as he later said of his demi-monde life, the danger was half the excitement. He truly fulfilled his childhood wish of entering a legendary court case of Regina v. Wilde, in defense of something ephemeral, something greater than just the law or just libel, which truthfully wasn't libel at all. Terrible as he was, the Marquess of Queensberry was never lying about Wilde being gay. His only crime was trying to weaponize it, and he correctly knew how to instigate both Wilde and his own son into their respective downfalls. Which was honestly not that hard. Wilde made unbearably poor decisions pretty much every step of the way. It boggles the mind why he didn't just take his friend's advice and ignore that card and go bide his time in France or something. But how could he turn down his own enormous ego and the whims of the temperamental man that he loved? Even so, his years in prison didn't fully crush Wilde's spirit. I don't think anything really could. Although he was impulsive, prone to poor decisions, and admittedly a toxic hoe, he had his finger on the pulse, as usual, of the nature of a fight we're still trapped in to this day. In 1898, Amidst his slowly failing health, he wrote in a letter, "Yes, I have no doubt we shall win, but the road is long and red with monstrous martyrdoms." Thank you for learning with me about the trials of Oscar Wilde. It truly was a wild one, but really, what it reminds me of is the fact that we have been here before many, many times. But there are things here that we can take inspiration from, and painful lessons we have to learn from. History may be cyclical, but it doesn't have to be circular. So, don't forget to grab a copy of my graphic novel, Liberated: The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun, and until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and try to be earnest.